Chapter 14 Conclusion Reactions 20th century fascism is a byproduct of disintegrating liberal democracy. Loss of hope in the possibilities of existing order and society, disgust with their corruption and ineffectiveness. Above all, the society's evident loss of confidence in itself. All these produce or spur a revolutionary mood in which the only issue lies in catastrophic action, but always with a strong social tinge. In quotations, I place my only hope in the continuation of socialist progress through fascisms, end quotations, writes Drieu. And the editor of the French fascist publication, The Insurgent, Jean-Pierre Maxence, would call insurgents of all parties to join, in quotations, the front of united youth, for bread, for grandeur, and for liberty, in immense disgust with capitalist democracy, end quotations. From this angle, as from many others, fascism looks much like the Jacobinism of our time. There is no doubt that, at least in France, it was the failure, real or apparent, of the established order to stand up for itself and for its own. It was this failure that created and recruited the troops of a certain fascist reaction. But the appearance of such movements may also be cited in evidence of the middle class's determination to defend themselves, a mood which a Paris candidate expressed when she told her electors that she, in quotations, remained violently moderate, end quotations. Movements of this sort can often be the pure expression of reaction. A social class or a body of men think their interests are threatened and organize to defend them. There is nothing social about such a reaction. It is hardly even a pretense. And since both reactionaries and fascists exalt violence as part of their policy, the contradiction between the former, who want settled order and security, and the latter, who want to destroy the settled order, is lost from sight. But, while social reaction and social thoughtlessness have made their contribution to fascism, we have seen that fascist doctrines and the fascist temper are far from reactionary in themselves. Characteristics. The confusion is understandable, for though fascist movements are revolutionary, they can only triumph in a situation which brings grist to their mill, by displacing people and resources from the camp of order into a no-man's land where they will listen to their appeals. There is, indeed, a profound connection between this revolutionary character and what we know of fascism's appeal to youth. In one sense, we recognize in all fascist-type movements a rising of younger generations against the old, who keep them from the manger. In 1933, Blum and Heriot in France were 61, Baldwin was 66, Ramsay MacDonald and the Belgian socialist leader Emile van der Velde 67, Hindenburg 86. Hitler and Mussolini were 44, Mosley 37, Doriot 35, Cadrenu 31, Jose Antonio 30, de Grelle 24. Figures like these speak for themselves. In brackets, see reading number 5a, end brackets. In a profounder sense, however, a revolutionary movement must recruit people who are all free in social position or in spirit. One cannot take great risks, run the chance of scandal or arrest, be available for anything at all hours if the thought of career or mortgage or an income holds one back. Only the very poor, the very young, in brackets, also perhaps the very rich, but there are few of those and even fewer who want to change the order from which they benefit, end brackets, can qualify for revolutionary action as opposed to writing or to talk, and they envisage it quite often as a way of ceasing to be non-entities or to be poor. The danger that the activist flame may be stifled by public position or material concerns is one all revolutionary parties face, and they resolve it by elitism and by decreeing that the gains of any victory shall be not particular but collective. They follow up their idealistic appeal with the attempt to connect private success with that of the collective, and to keep the militant from acquiring such vested interests in the status quo as to lose interest in continued revolution. Then, as and when they can, they do their best to train the youth to transfer its self-interest from self to party, that is to the nation. Meanwhile, like all minority movements, the fascists can only succeed when social circumstances provide a public their appeal attracts, or, at least, the resources that will help them win it. This was what happened to the Fascios, to the Nazis, and, briefly, to the French Leagues of the middle 20s. In France, however, as in Britain and Belgium, conditions never became bad enough for a tide of sympathy to float the local movements into power. Fascist and National Socialist movements were fated to remain minoritarian and, in brackets, while their doctrine often incorporated measures we should call progressive, end brackets, to win only by violence or to disappear. Alternatively, a fascist movement whose revolutionary and social character made it popular enough to attain power by legal means might be suppressed, as in Romania, by conservative forces, suspected and kept at arm's length as in Hungary, or used and then crushed as in Spain. In any case, the identification between fascism and reaction is widely off the mark. The identification of fascism and National Socialism is more understandable and better justified. It should be possible, however, to distinguish between the two, even if only at the doctrinal level. For, while what people say about their ideas does not always match what they actually do, it does reflect their assumptions, and it is usually respected, if only in the breach. Fascism. Fascism, as must be clear by now, rejects theory in favor of practice, and relies largely on the attraction of that fever to which I have referred. The fascist ethos is emotional and sentimental. At that level, the ends of action count less than action itself, and the forces that lead men into the fascist camp can be enlisted on any side whatever, provided they are given an opportunity to indulge themselves. The more violent, the better. This indiscriminate nature of fascism appears in figures as far apart as Mussolini, Doriot, and de Grelle, who militated in turn in a number of parties, pursuing action rather than ideas, power rather than principles. National Socialism. The National Socialist, on the other hand, seems much more theoretical. He may use theory merely to rationalize, but he respects it. Whatever he may pretend, words and ideas count for him as much as actions, and sometimes they replace them. What men like Diat seem to have sought was a new system which, unlike old ones that had been tried and found wanting, would help rebuild or repair the failing structure of the state. Although the program of the Arrow Cross or of the Iron Guard was profoundly mystical, the spirit animating such movements was of a different order from that which we find in the Fascios or in Rex. A doctrine may be crackpot, though dogmatic. The theories of Rosenberg, of Szalasi, of Quisling were both. But they differ less among themselves than they do from the cheerful pragmatism of Mussolini or de Grelle. All this may mean that the ideological National Socialist, in brackets, the kind we may, for instance, find in France, end brackets, will content himself with theorizing, but never go beyond the grandiose plans and dire threats he lavishes in print. It also lays him open to the charge, in brackets, as brought against the Nazis, end brackets, of using his theories as bait for the unwary, while in practice he advances through deals with the forces of capital, which are perhaps using him, after all, as John Strachey suggested. It is quite obvious, however, that the Nazis of all people were ready to make the most extraordinary sacrifices for the sake of their theories and their twisted ideals. It is true that Hitler was an opportunist who declared his aims very clearly and very early in the game, and then temporized on their accomplishment. But the deals and the sacrifices that he made, first to get into power and then to affirm his power, were expedients he abandoned as soon as possible. Industrialists like Fritz Thyssen, conservatives like Franz von Papen, moderate economists like Schacht, modern diplomats like Neurath, were shed or brought to heel or crushed as and when circumstances permitted, likewise the army. True, about 1927 and again in 1934, Hitler toned down the radical aspect of his movement in order to win the support of conservative forces that he had to conciliate. But in the next decade, the Nazi state affirmed its control ever more totally over every sector of national life, and, had it won the war, there would have been little that escaped its direction, little that remained private except in name. Differences. This, then, is where the basic difference seems to lie. Fascism is pragmatically activist, National Socialism theoretically motivated or, at least, expressed. Both aim to conquer power and that center of power which is the modern state. But in one case, the power will be wielded pragmatically and piecemeal, simply for its own sake, while the party which has been its instrument may gradually be abandoned. In the other, power will be used to realize an anterior plan or a series of plans inspired by the original doctrine, and then the party may become a church and a dynamo. Therein lie the nature and the major characteristics of movements which between them encompass a vast area of contemporary experience. Conceived in Europe like nationalism and Marxism, Fascism and National Socialism have become articles for export. The circumstances in which they grew, the sentiments that inspired them, the characteristics we have noted, may be found with variations in most political situations of the world today. Neither sympathy nor dislike are by themselves a satisfactory reaction to attitudes and ideas with which we must learn to cope. Fascist movements demand further investigation if we are to understand the many problems which confront us here and now. Narrator's closing remarks. This concludes both Part 1 of Varieties of Fascism, as well as Eugen Weber's discussion on the topic. Part 2, which follows, contains each of the readings that were periodically mentioned throughout the work, where, when listening, you heard reference to something like, in brackets, see reading number 2a, end brackets, it is found in Part 2. As with Part 1, the readings found in Part 2 are also narrated for you to access. However, it is important to note that Eugen Weber's personal contribution to Part 2 is often limited to a mere introductory paragraph explaining the reading to follow. Therefore, it is important to keep in mind that Part 2 recreates direct writings and experiences noted by Eugen Weber, but is not written by him. I personally hope you have learned a great deal about the movements covered, in part and in whole, by this work, whether it is Jacobinism, socialism, fascism, or National Socialism. For a more robust understanding of the people operating in these frameworks, I now invite you to listen to Part 2.